I'm Avery Dalton. And at 2:47 inches the morning, my mother burst into my bedroom with a crumpled loan contract and a voice sharp enough to cut through the dark, insisting the apartment I bought and maintained was hers to sell because she once co-signed a decade ago. And before I could speak, she flung the contract onto my blankets as if it were a verdict. She told me she had already taken the $50,000 from a private lender to cover Riley's latest disaster, demanding my keys while Riley staggered outside in the cold. Her silhouette tilting under the street lamp like the night itself couldn't steady her. I remember standing barefoot on the hardwood, staring at the ink bleeding across that paper and feeling the weight of her words press against my ribs. Then realizing the heavy winter coat hanging by my door still held the spare key to her new SUV from when I serviced it last week. Marianne didn't notice when I tossed the coat toward her, only snapped that I shouldn't be dramatic and to hand over the keys like a good daughter. And the moment her fingers closed around the coat's seams, she turned away with the triumphant breath of someone certain the world would bend for her again. Riley was already fumbling near the curb, muttering that she didn't owe me anything. And the two of them moved through the rain with the frantic purpose of thieves convinced they were clever. I didn't follow them, and I didn't reach for my phone. I only listened to the distant clatter of Riley dropping something metallic and heard her slur that she had it under control, letting the sound settle into the room like a hinge locking into place. The SUV lights flared to life soon after, bright and careless against the wet pavement, and as the engine growled through the quiet street, I understood that the night had shifted. Not because of the contract she threw at me, but because she never checked which keys she had stolen. Riley leaned against the SUV with her arms flailing in loose circles, muttering that the night wasn't over and tossing Marianne the coat like she was handing off a trophy. And the way her fingers fumbled across the fabric told me she hadn't noticed the weight of the key tucked inside the lining. Marianne urged her to hurry because we're not staying here to coddle Avery. And Riley barked out something slurred about taking back what was hers while she tried to steady herself on the slick curb. I stood behind the blinds with the window cracked just enough to catch Riley bragging that she didn't need my permission to drive anything, letting her voice drift upward with the thin edge of triumph that came only from not knowing what she held. The engine roared awake in a heavy, uneven growl, and Riley laughed through the exhaust that she'd prove she could handle a night like this, even if I couldn't handle real life. Her words tumbling out in the same rhythm as the rain, hitting the hood. Marianne snapped at her to stop showing off because they had places to be, but Riley waved her off and insisted the road would straighten out once she got a feel for the wheel, dragging the vowels through a hiccup she tried to disguise as confidence. I watched the SUV jerk forward hard enough to make the headlights twitch across the walls of the neighboring houses, and the motion tightened something low in my chest. Not from fear, but from recognizing how completely the moment aligned with the choices they had just made. They clipped the recycling bin at the end of the driveway with a hollow crash Riley dismissed as just a bump, and Marianne hissed that they didn't have time to argue as the SUV swerved toward the centerline with a wobble too sharp to ignore. Riley insisted she had it and shouted for the road to stop moving, her voice cracking under the strain of holding herself upright as the engine surged again. I counted the seconds from the moment the taillights dissolved into the curve, and when the dull crunch drifted back through the quiet street, I didn't reach for my phone or for them. I simply let the sound settle into the room as proof of the path they had chosen the moment they walked out with that coat. When the scanner app confirmed an abandoned vehicle matching Marianne's SUV 3 miles east, I opened my laptop and logged into the telematics dashboard I'd configured months earlier, watching the system pull up the night's footage with a precision that left no room for doubt. Riley appeared in the driver's seat with her hair stuck to her cheeks, lifting a half-empty bottle toward the camera while crowing that Avery can keep her sad little apartment because Mom says I'm the one worth investing in. The words warping at the edges as she bragged that no one would trace anything back to her. The video lurched when she veered too close to the guardrail, and the airbag burst across the screen in a white bloom, Riley greeted with a panicked gasp about ruining Mom's brand new tank. Then the feed went dark as the SUV settled into the ditch. I saved the footage to 2 external drives and a cloud folder, the cursor blinking against the timestamp that matched the moment the crash echoed through my street. And the tight alignment between the sound I'd heard and the frame I was watching left no space for revision. The contract Marianne had thrown onto my bed still sat at the corner of my desk, its ink bleeding along the crease where she'd crushed it. And beside it lay the fireproof safe where I kept the documents she never bothered to understand. Inside was the blue folder containing the quitclaim deed she'd signed 8 months earlier during the refinance she barely glanced at, insisting she didn't have time for technical paperwork while rushing out the door for a showing. The seal was still embossed on the corner, confirming my name as the sole owner and hers removed entirely. And the neat alignment of the signatures contrasted so sharply with the frantic scrawl on the loan contract that the comparison felt almost clinical. I placed the deed next to the flash drive holding Riley's footage, the two pieces forming a quiet pairing that carried the weight of everything they believed would never be challenged. By the time the sun began to press through the blinds, the documents on my desk made it clear that the story Marianne planned to tell could not survive the evidence she had unknowingly handed me long before she stormed into my room with that crumpled page. The call came just as the first light touched the edge of my desk, and Marianne's voice cut through the line with a brittle calm that carried more threat than volume, insisting I get downtown immediately because the insurance office won't wait while you wallow. She didn't pause before adding that Derek Vaughn was already there and growing impatient, and her warning that men who loan $50,000 don't appreciate being misled landed with the same clipped certainty she'd used when tossing the illegal contract onto my bed. I let her talk about how I'd walk in, accept responsibility, and fix the mess Riley created. And when she added that refusing her would be foolish because we both know whose signature is on every document that matters, the silence on my end stretched long enough for her breath to sharpen against the speaker. I told her I'd be there, and the quick exhale she released carried the triumph of someone convinced she'd cornered me, followed by instructions to dress appropriately because the adjuster would need to believe I understood the seriousness of what I'd done. She layered the warning with a final swipe that Riley was too shaken to show her face and that I should act like family for once, punctuating it with a click that left the room feeling smaller than it had an hour earlier. The moment the line went dead, the quiet settled around the deed and the flash drive on my desk, and the contrast between her scripted story and the evidence in front of me made the next steps as clear as the timestamp burned across the dash cam footage. I slipped both items into my bag and felt their weight shift against my shoulder as I locked the door behind me, the morning air still cold enough to sting after a night that hadn't really ended. The streets toward downtown Denver were washed clean from the early rain, and as I merged into the flow of traffic, the edge of Marianne's threat thinned under the steady hum of the engine. By the time the glass tower housing the insurance office came into view, the path she thought she controlled had narrowed into a single point, and all I had to do was walk toward it with the truth she had signed and Riley had recorded. The lobby smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old carpet, and Marianne was already pacing near the elevators with her blazer pulled tight, announcing the moment she saw me that, "You'll keep your head down and cooperate, because this can still be fixed if you don't complicate it." Riley slumped in a chair with oversized sunglasses masking the bruised fatigue around her eyes, murmuring that she couldn't believe I'd make Mom drag herself down here after everything she's done, letting the words drift just loud enough to sting without landing fully. I followed them toward the frosted glass hallway where the insurance office waited, the rhythm of our footsteps tapping against the tile in a pattern that made the morning feel narrower than the road they'd taken hours before. Thomas Ridley stood behind a long table with a stack of documents arranged in a grid, and Marianne introduced our situation with a polished breath, explaining that Avery took the SUV by mistake in the dark, panicked, and left it when she realized the damage was bad. Riley nodded without lifting her head, adding that I'd always been overly emotional, and Marianne used that to pivot into how this was my chance to take responsibility like an adult before the claim moved any further. Ridley slid a single affidavit across the table and mentioned the deductible and the exclusions in their policy, watching me closely as Marianne urged me to sign quickly so we can all move on. I sat in the metal chair opposite him, feeling the edge of the pen against my palm while Riley muttered that I should stop dragging this out, her voice thin and uneven. Marianne gestured sharply at the line awaiting my signature, insisting the company needed closure today because Derek Vaughn expects resolution. And the words carried the same forced calm she'd used on the phone when warning me about men who don't tolerate delays. The hum of the ventilation system filled the quiet between us. And as Ridley waited for my response, the weight of the deed and the flash drive in my bag pressed against my side like a quiet reminder of the truth already set in motion. I sat with the affidavit untouched, as Marianne pushed it closer and urged me to stop pretending you're confused, her voice tightening when she added that the company already knows you took the SUV. And the certainty in her tone settled over the room like a verdict she'd rehearsed for days. Riley tugged her sunglasses higher and muttered that I should just sign before Mom explodes, letting the accusation drift across the table like she wasn't the one who'd been caught in a ditch hours earlier. I reached into my bag with a calm that made Marianne blink. And when I placed my tablet flat between us and tapped the screen, the dashcam footage flickered to life with Riley's laughter spilling into the conference room as she crowed about driving Mom's brand new tank. Riley's face drained as her own voice filled the quiet, bragging that I'd cry over the stupid apartment while the real Dalton daughter gets a fresh start. And the moment the bottle clinked against the console, Marianne snapped that the footage was obviously tampered with by someone desperate. Ridley leaned forward as the camera captured the SUV drifting across the lane, and Riley squealing that no one will ever know because Mom can fix anything. His fingers pausing above the document stack as the airbag detonated in a burst that made Riley flinch in real time. When the screen cut to static, Ridley folded his hands and noted that the timestamp matched the report perfectly. And Marianne reached for my tablet with a frantic insistence that this isn't admissible, it's distorted. Her breath catching when Ridley reminded her the telematics came directly from the manufacturer's server. I set the flash drive on the table and told him the original file was already archived. And Riley whispered that this wasn't fair because it was supposed to be handled privately, her voice fraying as Ridley explained that filing a claim under a false driver constituted fraud. Marianne tried to pivot with a brittle composure, insisting the company needed to look at the facts, and her hand trembled slightly as she pushed the affidavit back toward me while murmuring that signing is the only logical choice. Ridley didn't pick up his pen, stating instead that the claim no longer aligned with the policy and that he'd need to escalate the case to their legal department. And Riley jolted upright when he added that law enforcement would be notified before the end of the hour. Before Marianne could protest, the conference room door opened and Derek Vaughn stepped inside with a calm that made the tension fold in on itself. And he remarked that he'd been told he'd receive a title transfer today. Marianne lurched toward her bag while insisting that Avery has the deed and needs to hand it over, the urgency in her voice sharpened by the sudden awareness of what she'd promised him. I pulled the blue folder from my tote and placed it beside my tablet, and Derek flipped through the pages only once before noting that the signature removing Marianne's name looked, well, notarized. Marianne's mouth went slack as she reached for the document with a stammer that dissolved when Derek turned the deed toward her and pointed at the county stamp confirming me as the sole owner. And Riley whispered that this couldn't be real because Mom handles everything. Derek closed the folder with a soft thud and observed that selling property you don't own counts as a fraudulent conveyance. And his voice stayed steady when he added that he expected repayment of the $50,000 by the end of the week. Marianne tried to blame me with a strained gasp that I'd tricked her into signing something technical. But Ridley cut through her panic by noting that deception surrounding an insurance claim could result in criminal charges regardless of family dynamics. And the shift in his tone made Riley reach for the edge of the table as if bracing against a sudden drop. I slid the affidavit back across the wood grain and told Marianne she could keep it because it didn't belong to me. And the look she leveled at me trembled between fury and disbelief as she hissed that I was tearing this family apart for no reason. Ridley stepped into the doorway to request the company's liaison join us for documentation, and Derek moved just enough to block Marianne's path as she tried to gather the papers she no longer had any claim to, casting a shadow across the pile she'd once believed she controlled. The room stayed painfully still as the weight of her choices pressed in from every angle. And I rose with the quiet certainty of someone whose part in the story had already shifted long before the first signature ever hit the page. Event logs settled across the table in a quiet that felt heavier than the room itself. And Ridley stepped out to meet the liaison, while Riley gripped the armrests and murmured that this was supposed to be a simple claim. Her voice thinning, as Derek reminded Marianne that repayment of the $50,000 was no longer negotiable. The hallway filled with clipped footsteps before two officers entered with a measured calm. And Marianne tried to gather her purse while insisting there had been a misunderstanding, the words unraveling when one officer requested verification of her identity. Riley's protest cracked into a whimper as the officers confirmed the dashcam file and the fraudulent title attempt. And the tremor in her breath deepened when the cuffs closed with a finality she couldn't outrun. I watched them lead the two of them toward the door, and Marianne twisted back long enough to spit that I'd ruined a family for pride. The accusation brittle against the evidence, scattered across the table. Derek lingered behind her retreating steps and remarked that the deed had saved me more trouble than I realized. And his eyes briefly traced the county stamp as if weighing the distance between what he'd been promised and what he'd received. Ridley returned to gather the affidavit that would remain unsigned. And he made a note that the claim would be closed pending investigation, the tone of his voice steady, with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for revision. When the room finally emptied, the silence felt different from the one that had followed the crash. Lighter, somehow. And I slipped my bag over my shoulder with the awareness that nothing tethered me to the story they tried to script. Outside, the Denver air held the last bite of morning chill. And as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a message confirming the sale of my new place had officially closed. I drove toward the highway with the steady hum of the engine settling in my chest. And by the time the city thinned into open sky, the weight I'd carried for years had begun to lift in a way that felt both unfamiliar and exactly right. The highway opened into a stretch of pale light as I headed north, and the quiet inside the car felt steadier than anything I'd known in years, shaped by the simple truth that no one was reaching for my hands to pull me backward anymore. I caught my reflection in the rear view and murmured that I was finally moving toward something that felt like my own life, letting the words slip out in a tone that surprised me with how gentle it sounded. The city thinned behind me while the road unwound ahead, and for the first time, the distance felt like a beginning rather than an escape. I thought about the people listening to this and whispered that endings don't always arrive the way we expect. But starting over can still be real, even when it comes late. And the hope in that thought settled somewhere deep and warm. The sun climbed higher across the horizon, brushing the dashboard in a soft gold that made the morning feel less like aftermath and more like a doorway left open. If you stayed through the story, thank you for sharing this stretch of road with me, and if pieces of your own life echoed through mine, I hope you'll subscribe so we can keep finding our way towards steadier ground together, choosing whatever peace looks like for us now.